So hi, good day everyone. I am Lyndi Mae Cabugnason and I am here to report my PowerPoint presentation on Module 2. So, Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York, United States. So, Sing Sing is a full correctional facility that has a maximum 800 cells, and it is originally known as Mount Pleasant Prison, and it was constructed on the village of Sing Sing on the east bank of the Hudson River. The Sing Sing prison was designed to provide additional prison space and to replace Newgate Prison. The construction was undertaken in the year 1825 by convict laborers under the supervision of Elam Lins. So Elam Lins is the warden of Auburn system. Elam Lins became head of the new prison when it opened in the 1826 and thought it was completed until 1828. So, as I have said, the initial facility of the Sing Sing prison had 800 cells. The prison population rose in the mid-19th century, resulting in more construction. So, the most early convicted criminals traveled by boat to Sing Sing, the face to the face of up to the river, which means going to prison. So the one of the most notable visitors of the prison was Alexis de Tocqueville. She is the author of the Democracy in America. The French government sent him and Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1831 to gather information about the American penal system. The two men were amazed at the total subjection and under which prisoners worked at the administrative power of the warden wielded at the Sing Sing, which is Elam Lins. Okay, so Elam Lins was resigned to as warden in Sing Sing in 1830 and returned to Auburn in 1838. However, he was asked to leave the prison because a year after a death of a prisoner who was punished for several fading illness, died. So, despite of this record, the Sing Sing rehired Lins in 1843. Whippings and floggings were compliance punishment at Sing Sing. So it is frequently used was the cat o' nine tails, a cruel whipping contraption whose lashes were often ripped with metal or barbs. So, while Lins was a warder, inmates were expected to refrain from making noise, which include talking. With the advent of the electric chair in 1891, Sing Sing became notorious for its execution. So, we all know familiarize the word electric chair. Electric chair is the equipment that used for executing criminals or executing offenders. So the infamous death chair or the electric chair was later moved to Greenhouse Prison, and Sing Sing was also the site of reforms that affected the national penal system. Okay, so the reformer Thomas Matt Osborne, who developed his penology theories while voluntarily incarcerated for a year at Auburn, served as Sing Sing's warden. But his immediate sweeping changes were assailed, and he resigned under intense political pressure. And during his tenure, however, the first psychological work with inmates began. More reforms were instituted under Louis Edward Laws, who served as a warden from 1820 to 1841. So in 1901, the residents of Sing Sing village changed its name to Osining because they wanted to distance or disassociate with the notorious prison. And that reason, in 1970, renamed the prison Osining Correction Facility. But that change did not stick. However, local merchants got a previous name restored in 1983, and thinking the cliche of Sing Sing, by then the prison was part of the American popular culture, and a place to receive them. In 1825, the state of New York appropriated more than $20,000 US dollars to purchase a 130-hectare site on the Hudson River for what is now the Sing Sing Correctional Facility. So, at that year, 100 incarcerated men was transported from the Auburn to what do you call this, to that new site of town of Mount Pleasant, but without a place to receive them or a wall to enclose them. So constructed by prisoners. To construct the 1825 cell block, the incarcerated excavated marble from nearby marble quarry. So they this was constructed by the 100 incarcerated men with a excavated marble. So the Sing Sing prison has the capacity of 800 cells, all built of Sing Sing marble. So each cell was 7 feet deep or 3 feet inches wide and 6 feet 7 inches high. So on November 26, 1828, the incarcerated occupied their cells for the first time. So within a few years, the men continued to mine Sing Sing marble, which was used in the construction of such notable buildings as Lyndhurst, New York University, Grace Church, the New York State Capitol Building, and the United States Treasury Building. And the Sing Sing Correctional Facility is a maximum security prison operated by the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision in Ossining, New York. Sing Sing's almost 200-year history earned it a worldwide reputation at a notorious prison, but it is unfair to recognize it only for these reasons. So today, Sing Sing is considered a model correctional facility with its innovative rehabilitation programs for the incarcerated. So as you can see at the pictures, these are the areas of the Sing Sing prison, including the infamous death chair. So let's talk about the two systems, which is the Auburn and Pennsylvania systems. These were both based on beliefs that criminal habits were learned from and reinforced by other criminals. So first, let's talk about Auburn system. So to summarize it up, Auburn system is a system that in which person you work during the day and were kept in solitary confinement at night with the enforced silence at all time. So this system um, uh, is also known as the silent system. So Auburn system is that they strictly discipline the the offenders or the incarcerated, where from the work from the work, the marching through marching alignment, the seating arrangement, the um, the what you call this, the uniforms and the uh, the formation when going out to their cells. Whereas Pennsylvania system inmates did handicraft work in their cells. So while Auburn prisoners labored in concrete workshop, offsetting imprisonment caused by fulfilling private industry contracts. So Pennsylvania systems are what you call this, separation system. So there was a hidden passageway with small openings surrounded the work area that only allows inspectors and visitors to surreptitiously monitor the inmates. So Auburn briefly implemented three levels of classification system. Under it, minor offenders labored in workshop during the day and retired to separate cells at night. Serious offenders alternated their days between solitary confinement and congregate work. So the most hardened criminals were placed in solitary confinement without work. After numerous suicides, instances of mental illness, and attempted escapes, the governor of the New York terminated the classification system and the experiment in solitary confinement. So all inmates, male inmates, worked in congregated shops by day, returning to the individual cells at night, while females first committed to Auburn in 1825 were relegated to an attic and excluded from regular work and exercise. So in response to Bell's, head-shaven inmates dressed in striped clothing silently marched in lockstep formation to and from their cells for meals and work assignments. Letters were banned and the chaplain was the only occasional visitors. Eventually, overcrowding made the silent system unenforceable, and Auburn's system of discipline deteriorated into corrupt and lax routines of harsh punishments. After the Civil War, the spirit of reform withered and contract labor was no longer profitable. So despite the demise of the ideal system, Auburn remained the model for nearly a century, primarily because it had been expensive to construct and maintain. So the Auburn system was meant to rehabilitate prisoners through the basis of discipline and hard work. So as I have said, the Auburn prison system is they strictly discipline all the inmates and force to hard works, and that which the prison gain money profits. So the this system also forced the stereotypical prison uniform. So uh, prisoners were kept in grounds during the day and they had to march in certain formation. The lockstep involves inmates linking arms and the person in front of them and casting their eyes down. So the inmates at night, they were placed in solitary confinement. The major distinction of the Auburn system was to enforce silence at all time. This is why it is called silent system. So by keeping inmates silent, it supposedly would make them more obedient and compliant. Because of this, the system was also known as the silent. Just I have said. So because of Auburn's system, it some inmates died from harsh punishments. Because Auburn's system implemented many punishment such as whipping, ice baths, and the yoke. So some inmates died from this punishment. And other things that the Auburn system implemented were 2-foot extensions of the walls between cells, new seating arrangement for when eating. So although the prison system is seen today as inhumane and extremely brutal, in that time people considered it as a progress of long-term imprisonments and death penalties for any offenses, both big or small. So as seen in a Westchester Herald newspaper report of a visit to the prison, they claim that they are highly pleased with the institution and do not hesitate to pronounce it superior. So the second system is a Pennsylvania system. It is based on the principle that solitary confinement fosters penitence and encourages reformation. The idea was advocated by the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, whose most active members were Quakers. I have mentioned earlier the Pennsylvania system is so-called has separated philosophy. So the prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells 16 feet high and nearly 12 feet long. So it has an exercise yard that ensures and completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners and was attached to each cells. Prisoners doesn't so no one except institution officers or and occasional visitors. Let's move on to the Pennsylvania prison system history and reform. In the early punishment, his fellow colonists would tell William lived a life of crime. So William's ears were crumpled and has a mark scarred in his back, not tattoo but marks. And his right palm had a charred B for Bulgari and the left is for R and rogue. His crimes piled any higher and higher and higher. Made the decision that the death was the last best hope of the colony leaders to had for his reform. But his great-grandson Edward also led a life of crime in the Pennsylvania colony. But his grandson has no scars or bands betrayed his deeds. So the today's standards, crime and punishment in early colonial times seem both petty and horrific. During William's time, retribution was the primary goal and punishment was both excruciating and public. So a death sentence met those who committed the biggest like murder and the biggest crime like murder and rape. And for all other sins like um, lying, skipping church, adultery, loitering, um, their punishment is torture and public humility. So, respite or the birth of reform. William Penn, the founder of the Pennsylvania colony, having suffered in the prisons of England, ushered in reforms in 1860. Those convicted of small crimes got bail, and more serious crimes were punished by hard labor. The jails were replaced with workhouses where the prisoners worked most of the day and learned to trade the useful when released. Free food and rudimentary health care was provided. Torture and humiliation was replaced with a modicum of dignity and humanity. So, William Penn died in 1718, and by all accounts, his reforms died with him. Hard labor and floggings replaced branding and maiming. And though retribution was still the stated goal, reformation of the offender is now being openly considered. So the Quaker Friends and the Pennsylvania Prison Society. So in 1787, Benjamin Franklin and a group of fellow Quakers formed the Philadelphia Society for alleviating the miseries of public prisons. These later became the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and they began lobbying for significant reforms in the prison system. So they got their wish in 1780. Legislation was passed and converted a city jail built on Walnut Street in 1773 to the nation's first penitentiary. So the Quakers believed that separate system should be instituted where a prisoner could seek penitence through isolation and reflection, so no punishment. So the Pennsylvania Society pressured the legislature to expand the Walnut Street model across the state. Dignitaries and officials from other states and England visited to see and judge these reforms for themselves. The Pennsylvania prison system possessed the following attributes. First is isolation to foster penitence, as the prisoner had time to reflect on his and her misdeeds. These are the forms of punishment in early correctional history: stocks and pillories, sweeps, house of correction, gossip birdie, docking stool, lockups, county gaol, branding, death for witchcraft, transportation, judgment of penance, capital punishment, boring to death, hung, drawn, and quartered, gibbet. So, houses of correction. So these places were used on 1938 with the passing of the police act. This house of correction separates every every inmates, and it was passed at all shires of at least one on house of correction for rogues, vagabonds, and study beggars. And gossip bridle, as you can see in the picture, an iron frame was placed over the head. So in this equipment or punishment, the woman was led through the streets by using attached chain, and or was trained to whipping post and subject to insult to degradation or humiliation. So whipping the back of a woman, or pillories also were used as a whipping tool, and you whip on the back of the women. So, and the capital punishment, it is a death penalty and frequently used up to 1829, and it was only used for crimes of murder or high treason. So only the biggest crimes and will experience the capital punishment. Lockups. So these replaced the pillories and usually housed brawlers and drunkards. They were also used as overnight accommodation for prisoners being transported across the country for witchcraft. So witch hunting became popular in the year 1603 to 1625. So they executed the they execute witch. So some people protested that some were innocents or some were innocents were hanged. So it was finally abolished in the year 1736. So burning to death. This is the brutal punishment for all women who committed treason, and it was replaced with hanging from around 1790s. Ducking stool was used mostly for brawling women from the around 1560 to 1750. So culprit was placed on a stool attached to a wooden arm which swiveled from an upright post beside a pan. The number of duckings was usually 3. Gibet, as you've seen in the picture, once a murderer was convicted and hung, his body was taken to the scene of the crime and hung in a gibbet, a frame especially made for the victim. Okay, so let's move on to different types of criminal punishment. So the following are 5 of the most commonly seen types of criminal punishment. The first is incapacitation. So incapacitation separates or moving criminals away from society to prevent future crimes. So this punishment can be traced to ancient times. Trent Smith and Hong Lu write in this punishment. Second is deterrence. Deterrence is to persuade citizens and possible offenders or reoffenders to conform to the rules of law. So Smith and Lu explain that the 4 types of deterrence are generally recognized as specific deterrence analyzes how effective punishment is and on individuals' future behavior. Second is general deterrence seeks to understand how individual punishment can deter others from committing crimes. So the next is marginal deterrence. Seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. And the fourth is partial deterrence, refers to a situation in which the threat or penalty has some deterrent value even when someone engages in illegal behavior. So the effectiveness of the deterrence is criminal punishment that is difficult to assess because people may follow the law for or other reasons that may be challenging to track, such as a religious or moral beliefs, physical incapacitation, or lack of opportunity. The third types of criminal punishment is retribution. Retribution is one of the oldest forms of punishment. Retribution has roots in the Judeo-Christian religion of justice, and in the book of Lisa M. Storm, it explains that retribution prevents crime by giving victims or societies a certain sense of satisfaction that a defendant has been punished appropriately, reinforcing the belief so that the criminal justice system is working effectively. So the fourth types of punishment is rehabilitation. So it is a common prison policy that rehabilitation focus in helping criminals and prisoners overcome the barriers that led them to committing criminal acts. This includes develop the occupational skills, as well as the resolving psychological issues such as drug addiction and aggression. Um, it is considered the opposite of retribution. The ultimate purpose of rehabilitation is to transition offenders back into the society. The fifth is restoration, a radically different approach to criminal punishment. The goal of restoration is for the offender to make direct amends to both the victim and the community in which the crime was committed. Although this is a new practice in modern times, the concept of restorative justice can be found in the early legal system of Western Europe, ancient Hebrew justice, and pre-colonial African society. So, during the process of restoration, victims initiate a process in which both they and the offender meet the shared feelings and concerns. For example, apology, that is the best example of that, and the dialogue of the offender's victims, the opportunity to be heard, and the offender to make amends and receive forgiveness. So, restorative justice is often used in crimes involving youth offenders. Okay, so the ages of enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, it is an intellectual and cultural movement that emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. So the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Voltaire used the power of press to spread new ideas about fairness, investigation, and religious tolerance through the Europe and the Americas. So many consider the Enlightenment a major turning point in Western civilization. So an age of letter placing is an age of darkness. Several ideas dominated Enlightenment thought, including rationalism, empiricism, progressivism, and cosmopolitanism. So rationalism is idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge. Um, this was a sharp turn away from the prevailing idea that people needed to rely on scripture or church authorities for knowledge. And empiricism promotes the idea that knowledge comes from experience and the observation of the world, not from other other things. So, and progressism is the belief that through their powers of reason and observation, humans can make unlimited linear progress over time. This belief was especially important as a response to the carnage and upheaval of the English civil wars in the 17th century. And the last, cosmopolitanism reflected Enlightenment thinkers' view of themselves as the actively engaged citizens of the world, as opposed to provincial and cost-minded individuals. In all, Enlightenment thinkers endeavored to be ruled by reason, not prejudice. So, the Enlightenment took hold in the European countries, other often with a specific local emphasis. The cultural exchange during the Age of Enlightenment run between particular European countries and also both in directions across the Atlantic. And there were two distinct lines of Enlightenment thought. The radial Enlightenment advocated democracy, individual liberty, freedom of expressions, and eradication of religious authority. A second is more moderate variety sought of accommodation between reform and the traditional system of power and faith. Um, so science also became play a leading role in Enlightenment discourse. The Enlightenment has long been hailed as the foundation of modern Western political and intellectual culture. But it brought political modernization to the West in religion. Enlightenment era commentary was a response to the preceding century of religious conflicts in Europe. So historians face a gender and class note that Enlightenment ideal were not originally envisioned as universal in the today's sense of the word. Although did not eventually inspire the struggles of rights of people of color and women or the working masses, most Enlightenment thinkers did not advocate equality for all, regardless of race, gender, beliefs, class, but other insisted that Christ's freedoms were not hereditary. So we're gonna talk about the peoples of these um, enlightenment. I will not um, read all of this, but I will just give some of the um, descriptions of these people. So the first is Beccaria Cesar Donicia Marqua of 1738 and 1794. So Beccaria is an Italian economist and proponent of judicial reform. Um, he was the author of the most famous Italian work of the Enlightenment. So on crimes and punishment in 1764. So he was born on noble family of the state of Milan. It is a part of Austrian Habsburg Empire and was schooled by the Jesuits in Parma. He receives his law degree from a university and returned to live in Milan. And Beccaria's 20s are the most important decade in his intellectual and emotional life. So um, he was temperamentally inclined to lethargy, anxiety, but when young could also be galvanized by inspiration and express his feelings in the language of Russia. He married his first wife in 1761 against strong resistance from his family. He wrote the on crimes and punishment in 1763 when he was 25. He has a friend, Petro Veri, young Milanese reform and outlast the 1760s. So Beccaria assumed prestigious public lectures in the Schola Palatine on cameral science. Accomplished lot of achievements in his life. Like he mastered in literature, and his teaching was impregnated with Enlightenment ideal, and he understands the evolution of human society and improving the lives of entire population. Let's move on and Cesar Lombroso, the born criminal. Lombroso and the origins of modern criminology. He is the father of modern criminology, and his theory of the born criminal dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century, believing essentially that criminal was inherited and that criminals could not be identified by physical attributes such as hawk-like noses and blood-hot eyes. Lombroso was one of the first people in history to use scientific method to study crime. So, Lombroso found Villalella interesting, so he gave his extraordinary ability and cynicism to boast of his escapades and abilities. And after Villalella's death, um, he conducted a post-mortem and discovered that his subject had an indentation of the back of his skull which resembled the found in apes. So Lombroso gathered or concluded that the These evidence, as well as the form of other criminals, had studied that some were born with a propensity to offend and were also savage throwbacks to early men. Also, Lombroso wrote, "At the sight of the skull, I seemed to see all of the sudden, lighten up as a vast plain under a flaming sky, the problem of the nature of the criminal, an atavistic being who reproduces in his person that ferocious instincts of primitive humanity and inferior animals." So he believed that all criminality was being inherited and not be identified by physical defects that confirm that as being atavistic or savage. So he wrote his first book to examine the causes of female crime, concluded, among other things, female criminals were far more ruthless than male. He did he wrote some of that. So to study the human crimes. So a familiar face. Lombroso was a well-known personality in Italy, giving sell-out lecture and talks and commenting on all kinds of things in the popular press. He was interested in many things, and sometimes had difficulty in focusing on one thing at a time. One of his daughters, Paula, described a typical day in his life. So he was also endlessly curious about crime, criminals, and their motivation for offending, as well as their culture. He collected artifacts created by the belong of the prisoners and he had encountered during his long career. Investigator. So he gathers all the the belongings of the suspect or the victim to to identify what his motivation, what is his what's the reason he committed that that work or that crime. So he is also interested in hypnotism, paranormal activity, and spiritualism. So he wants to he also wants to study on criminal in the sections of adultery, frigidity, lesbianism, masturbation, and premarital sex. His work or he has a work called Criminal Women that that discuss on the causes and characteristic of the prostitution. So let's move on Lombroso's last book. It published after his death and was discussed of the biology of the spiritual world, and surprisingly, it had a mixed reception, and his research into ghosts, poltergeist, telepathy, and levitation appropriately disappeared into the earth either. It did, however, add to the general discrediting of Lombroso's ideas over the years, and for some time his work was viewed as being more of the curiosity value than anything else. So he introduced the idea that criminality was not a matter of a sin or free will, but could instead be a medical problem that needed to be examined by experts in that field. So Lombroso also published the result of his investigation in his man work L'Uomo Delinquente, or The Criminal Man, the first published in 1876. It illustrates his research works, the body of the certain body's characteristic, and the shapes of the certain types of criminals or crimes. So Cesar Lombroso's anthropological theory of crime in four core statements. These are: the criminal can be distinguished from non-criminal by numerous physical and psychological anomalies. The second is the criminal is a variety of the human species, an anthropological type of degenerative phenomenon. The third, the criminal is an atavism, a degeneration to a primitive, subhuman type of human being. Criminals are modern savages. Physical and mental setbacks to an earlier stage of human history to phylogenetic path. So criminal display physical and psychological characteristics that were believed to have been overcome in the history of development. So the fourth is crime is inherited. It arises from the critical disposition. So the next, let's move on to the next is William Conqueror. William the First, William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, or William of the Normandy. He made himself the mightiest noble in the France and changed the course of England history by his conquest of that country. So William born in the 1020 in the city of Falaise, but he was his parents were not married, making him an illegitimate child. But despite being an illegitimate child, William grew up and was raised by the future Duke of Normandy when William was 7 years old. So some have challenged William because they believe that he is not deserving because he is an illegitimate child. But after years, he proved that, and he proved that he is, although he is an illegitimate child, he is also deserving to be the Duke of Normandy. So William married Matilda of Flanders. This was a political marriage and allied William with the powerful Duchy of Flanders. Matilda and William would have 4 sons and 5 daughters. So invading the England. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, died in 1006. He did leave heirs to the throne, but William was related to the king through Edward's uncle Richard II. But other men, William also claimed that Edward had promised him the crown. But other men claimed the crown of England, and one of them is his cousin Harold Godwinson. So, the people of England wanted Harold to be the king and crowned him King Harold II. The day after King Edward died, another man who claimed the English throne was King Hardrada of Norway. When King Hardrada of Norway invaded England and King Harold II went to meet him in battle, William saw his chance. He gathered an army across the English Channel, making come near the Hastings. So after King Harold defeated the Norwegian invaders, William, however, was ready for battle. William brought archers and heavily armored cavalry called knights. Harold's foot soldiers were no match for William's forts, and William won the battle and the King Harold II was killed by an arrow. So William became the King of England and continued to march across England and eventually captured the city of London. So the Anglo-Saxon revolts. William spent the first several years of his reign putting down revolts on northern England and ordered much of the country destroyed. His army burned farms, destroyed food, and killed livestock through the area. This act became known as the Harrying of the North and caused the death of at least 100,000 people. So one of the William's most lasting legacies was to build a castle. He built castles throughout England in order to maintain control of everything, and perhaps of the most famous castle William built is the White Tower of the Tower of the London. Doomsday Book. So in 1085, William ordered a full survey of the land holdings of all the England. He had men go around or survey the land and record own the land and all the property they had, including such things as livestock, farm equipments, mills. This information was all put into a single book called the Doomsday Book. So William died while leading a battle in northern France in 1087. His oldest son Robert became Duke of Normandy, and his second son became the King of England. So interesting facts about William the Conqueror is even when he was a king of England, he spent most of his time in Normandy. William's wife Matilda was only 4 feet and 2 inches tall. Unlike many mortals of his duty, it is thought that William remained faithful to his wife. To conquer England, William gathered men from Normandy, France, and even other countries in Europe. He promised them land in England for their service. He rode into battle riding a black stallion that had given him by the king of Spain, and William was crowned king, and the English nobles attending ceremony shouted their approval. And unfortunately, William's soldiers outside the abbey thought it was an attack. They began to burn down the nearby buildings. So let's move on to Enrico Ferri. He's another chief exponent of the positive school of criminology. He challenged Lombardian view of criminality through his scholarly researches. Ferri proved that mere biological reasons were not enough to account for criminality. They firmly believed that other factors, emotional reaction, social infirmity, geographical conditions also play a vital role in determining criminal tendencies in men. So the major contribution of Ferri of the held of criminology is his law of criminal saturation. These theories presupposes that the crime is the synthetic product of three main factors, and which is physical or geographical, anthropological, and psychological or social. So Ferri worked out a five-fold classification of criminals. It named born criminals, occasion criminals, passionate criminals, insane criminal, and habitual criminals. So some Enrico Ferri's background. Imagine if someone declared that you were a murderer based not on anything you had done, but because of the shape of your head. Even if you hadn't murdered anyone, the shape of your head showed that you were predisposed to murder. Pretty absurd, right? So while this seems obviously false today, in the 19th century, this was considered the cutting of edge of criminology. Criminologists were trying to find out how to measure criminal behavior in quantitative and scientific way. Their effort was called positivism. And let's move on to the last person, Clifford Robshaw. Robshaw was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s, and he is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. The environmental criminology, the early Chicago schoolwork and the mapping that was done helped lay the foundation of the environmental criminology perspective. So the crime mapping. So crime mapping is a tool used in many law enforcement agencies across the country that focus on spatial patterns of crime that GIS, through the use of crime mapping technology, provides a computerized display of where the crimes where are occurring or where has occurred. And the social disorganization and rural communities. So social disorganization is defined as an inability of community members to achieve shared values or to solve jointly experienced problems. In recent decades, the themes of social disorganization theory have been more clearly articulated and extended by Cornusser. So, Shaw and Mackay traced social disorganization to condition and endemic to the urban areas that were the only places the newly arriving poor could afford to live. In particular, a high rate of turnover in the population, the mixes of people from different cultural backgrounds, and Shaw and Mackay's analysis relating delinquency rates to these structural characteristics established key facts about the community correlates of crime and delinquency. So the ethnic diversity. According to the social disorganization theory, it could be expected that urban areas or rates of juvenile violence would be higher in rural communities with greater ethnic diversity. So according to Shaw and Mackay, ethnic diversity interfaces with communication among adults. Effective communication is less likely in the face of ethnic diversity because differences in customs and lack of shared experiences may breed fear and mistrust. So it is very important to distinguish um, this driven hypothesis about heterogeneity from simple ethnic differences in offense rates, and this hypothesis sees crimes as arising from relations between ethnic groups, not from some groups being more crime prone than others. So, family disruption. Researchers in urban areas has found that delinquency rates are higher in communities with greater level of family disruption. Um, that these would also be true in rural areas. Samson argued that sacred parenting strains parents' sources of time, money, and energy, which interferes with their ability to supervise their children and communicate with others adults in the neighborhood. Furthermore, the smaller the number of parents in the community relative to the number of children, are the more committed the networks of adult supervision will be for all the children. So let's move on to the economic status. Although the rates of juvenile violence are higher in urban areas with the lower economic, it was not clear that this relationship should apply in rural settings. The role of economic status in social disorganization theory is based on patterns of growth in urban areas. In many urban areas, growth leads to physical, economic, and social decline as the residential and as closest to the central business district. These areas then became most readily available to the poor and to the groups who migrate to the area. As a result, area with the lowest average socioeconomic status will also have the greatest residential instability and ethnic diversity. So, which in turn will create social disorganization. Many studies have found that urban neighborhoods with high rates of poverty also have greater rates of delinquency. So, density. Population density is rather different from other community factors of two reasons. First, evidence of relationship between population density and urban crime and delinquency is inconsistent. Second, the meaning of density becomes quite different from non-urban communities where in the less dense areas, one must travel several miles to have significant contact with people outside of one's immediate family. So the proximity to urban areas is this final community variable which departs from the themes of current social disorganization theory, consideration issues specific to our rural settings, and the linkages among communities. So, as Heidegger and Bursick have argued, it is important to look beyond the internal dynamics of community and considered ways in which rate of delinquency might be influenced by relationship between neighboring. Some various rural and suburban communities have different relationship with urban communities, and this is an important theme of research and rural settings. Heigert and Bursick suggested that less delinquent groups of youth are being socialized into more sophisticated types of criminal behavior by youths in adjoining areas because average crime rates are higher in communities with larger populations. This phenomenon would produce higher rates of delinquency in rural communities that are adjacent metropolitan areas. And that would be all of my that would be all of the discussions in module 2. Thank you.